to Lynne Mayers. We very much look forward to hearing this talk. So we've included Bal Maidens as part of our current exhibition, Women of Cornwall, and we really look forward to hearing more about them. So Lynne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alice and Amanda, for setting this all up. As you'll gather from that introduction, I'm by no means a social historian. I'm very much an amateur, coming from originally the family history side of things. And what triggered this whole, what has been a 20-year journey of trying to find out about the work of the Bal Maidens was, like I'm sure many of you will have done, perhaps come across a census entry written against, it was actually my great-grandmother's name, Mine Girl, when I was expecting it to be, my family expecting them to be a family of shopkeepers in Truro. They weren't, they were miners in Herons Abulow. And my great-great-grandmother, along with her siblings, all at the mine. So that was the beginning of a journey. It's been a huge learning curve. And whenever I share something like this, I always expect that I will get as much back from it as I've shared, because you people out there have information about your families, perhaps about Bal Maidens in your family, and it's a sharing experience, I hope, a mutual learning. And so with that in mind, I think if we could have the first slide, please, Amanda. You'll notice here that I've put, entitled this talk, Bal Maidens of Cornwall and West Devon, even though this is coming to you from set up by Crescent Kerno, specifically for Cornwall. And that is because I'm sure many of you will know that so much of the Cornish mining technology went around the world, but also over the West Devon border. And so the management techniques, the ways of working and the customs overlapped into West Devon. And if any of you are part of the Cornish diaspora, your mining families may well have actually started off mining in Cornwall, but may well have moved elsewhere via having moved to the West Devon mines. So there's a little bit of an overlap because it just ties in, and you can't unravel all the threads. And we're going to be looking at, firstly, the general context in which these Bal Maidens worked. And the first thing to say is that they never officially worked underground. It was not allowed, it was considered unlucky. And on the odd occasion that a female did get underground to work, it was usually completely as a sort of hidden and secretive thing. And so they were working at surface, mostly preparing ore for smelting, but not entirely. And we'll be looking at that as well. We will also be looking at the costs of their work. But if we can have the next slide, please. I think we can assume that women and girls and boys were working at the mines, if you could call them that, in Cornwall from antiquity, from the very earliest tin mines or tin works. Then surely women and girls and boys were part of this sort of community effort of sorting out the tin and dressing it, getting ready for smelting, and indeed probably helping with the smelting. But we have no firm records. And the first definite records we have for women and girls working in the mining industry in Cornwall is from the Calstock silver lead smelters at the very beginning of the 14th century, around about 1305. And again, we don't have images, but this is the nearest image I can find to show the sort of work that the women and girls might have done at the smelter at Calstock in that time, and they were washing slags and preparing them between smeltings. There were generally 2 smeltings, and a washing and a re-breaking of the slag in between the 2 smeltings, and they would be involved in doing that sort of work, very much as we see in this picture, which is a much later illustration, but washing slags in a sieve in water. Although at Calstock, we believe it was at somewhere called Davy Pool, and we're not sure where Davy Pool is or was. So it was probably just washing directly into the water. And so we had the very first records that were kept for Calstock for the smelters. Now they were receiving lead ore from over the river in Beer Alston, Beer Ferris area. And it's believed that in a similar way, women and girls were involved in preparing the ore as it came up from the mines on the other side of the river. So those are the very earliest records that we have. And if we move on to the next slide, and contemporary with that, we do have records of women involved in the tin industry and tin mining and tin works across Cornwall and Devon. Now, most of the records, these early records, round about the 14th century, actually come from Devon, and the next slide will show a little bit of that. But the illustration we've just seen shows the sort of simple washings that they might have been involved in way back in the early 14th century through really probably to about the 16th or 17th century. We will have the next slide now, please, Amanda. And if you run your eye down, you can pick out a few Cornish tin workers here with the date. We've got Redruth, we've got, where have you got? We've got Truro. All the others are over the border. Not very Cornish names here, are they? Some of them we can recognise names that relate to places. And we see from these records that women were involved in tin trading, usually on the death of their husband. They continued in the trade. Some of them were actually working in tin works with their husbands, have a shared lease where it says tin streamer. And we have Joan Winsand down the bottom, who was a lessee for tin stamps in Tavistock, and Joanna Reed, who was a lessee of a tin smelter in Tavistock. These records are hard to find, but it just gives us an idea that women and girls were involved in a very hidden way from early on. The next slide, please. But for Cornwall, the main records that we start to pick up are from about 1720, mostly from cost books held at Crescent-Kerno. And so here we have just a selection of some of the earliest numbers of females working, picking copper ore right back at the beginning, if you like, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, of how mining was becoming industrialized because of the change of the way in which ore was raised, using steam power for raising ore and pumping the mines out so that the mining was going deeper and becoming far more economic. Far more ore was raised to surface, and so more and more people were needed to actually dress the ore as it came up. And we see this gradually developing through the 18th century. The next slide. But the records are very patchy until we get into the 19th century. And of course, one of the best sources, other than the cost books, for the Cornish mines for finding information about women and girls is the census records. I'm sure we're all aware that census records are really difficult because they're not necessarily consistent. Some of them are missing, some of them you can't read, some of them have been damaged, and the information collected there isn't consistent. But at least the bottom line is, where we find a named woman or girl who's obviously worked at the mines, then that is an indication of the minimum number that we can assume were there. Now, don't get too worried about the detail of this map, but this is looking at the distribution of Bal Maidens from the beginning of the census records from 1841, the full census records. So what I want you to think about is, firstly, how many white parishes are there and how many are coloured? And the first thing, I think that shows that at least 50% of the parishes in Cornwall at some point or another had some form of mining activity there, and indeed had a female, a woman or a girl working in that industry at some point in time. So this isn't a total figure here, it's the maximum number at any point in time off the census, but it gives us that indication that at least 50% of the parishes were engaging in this industry and were employing females at the mines or the quarries or the clay works, whatever it is. And the second thing, just, the darker the colour, the more there were. So just look at the red bits. And the most female employment was to be seen down at the St Just end, right, starting from the West End down at Land's End. The first red blob is St Just. Then we move up into this central mining district, which covers around Helston. We go into Camborne, Iluggan, Redruth, St Agnes, Kenwyn, Gwenup, Perrinzabulow. And that was really always the heart of female employment, just in the way that it was the heart of the mining industry. And of course down into Brieg and Gurmo and down that way. And then going east again, the next red blob is the St Austell area, St Blaise, Tywardreath, and the upside down T, east again, that is St Cleer. So we're looking at the Phoenix mines on the edge of Bodmin, southern edge of Bodmin, and then right over onto the Devon border, that funny little red blob with a bit of a tail is Calstock. And if we were to continue the map into Devon, we would also have a red blob for the parish of Calstock and other mining parishes beyond that. Have the next slide. And this is just showing the census information in a different way. And that is the total for Cornwall, just for Cornwall, from 1841 through to 1911. And bearing in mind that we believe that these are just the minimum numbers and that in reality there would have been more. 1841 will certainly be under-recorded because so often the enumerators were only recording the head of household's occupation. And that seems to be true, certainly for the Cornish parishes, but very rarely, it's not often that other people within the family who are earning are registered, and certainly very few women or girls. But the trend other than that, as you can see, is to peak round about 1861. The actual peak probably would come about 1863, 1864, because that is the point at which the copper mine, the bottom fell out of the Cornish copper mining industry. And so many of the copper mines closed for the very last time. And the mining that continued from there on was mostly tin and other minerals. And there are several things happening here. Firstly, the world prices for minerals was changing and dropping for Cornish metals. And also women and girls and boys were being replaced by technology. But that had been happening since about 1820. But it was masked by, in Cornwall, by the increase in actual mining activity until the 1860s. And so you see, dropped away very, very quickly from 1871 to almost nothing by 1900. And I haven't got the figures for 1921 yet. It's not easy to access the sort of information you need in the format you want at the moment. But I'm guessing there probably won't be any, because from other records, female employment in Cornwall at the mines was over by 1922, I think, completely. The next slide. And although people might think, oh, Bal Maidens, they were at the tin mines and the copper mines, they were at almost every mine, metal mine that was open in Cornwall. And the larger the word here, or if it's underlined, the more they were engaged in that industry. But you can see copper, tin, lead, silver, arsenic were the main minerals that they were addressing, but also smaller numbers with all these other products. The next slide, please. And this is just another way of showing that. Don't worry about the detail. Just look at the different colours and the list. And that's those are all the places and all the different mines where records of female employment has been found. Yeah, it's okay. Next one, please. One of the other things that you can get from the census records is the age, which you don't get from any other records, not from the cost books or very few other records. And interesting, again, don't worry about the detail, just look at the shape. And as you'll see, for every census year, the shape is more or less the same, regardless of 1876 Education Acts and all girls under 14 supposedly being in education by 1880. And so right through until 1911, the most common age for women and girls being employed was between about 15 and 22, 23 when they married. And once you were married, that was it. You had no entitlement to work at the mines, and you were given your cards if such things existed. And the very youngest that we found, 6 years old, and the very eldest working into their 70s. If you were single, you worked for life unless you could find some other employment. As I say, if you married, then your work stopped. But very often, if you married a miner who was killed at a particular mine or went into decline at a particular mine, it seems that there will be some sort of preferential employment for you to come back in, very often as a count house woman, or preferential employment for your sons and daughters. Next slide, please. Right, this is on a flying thing. If you can do that's it. This is just an illustration to show the ages and the circumstances, the different circumstances in which people might be employed. Minnie Andrews, starting on the left, Minnie Andrews, she went to work in Carnbray at 9 years old when her father died, and she had to become one of the breadwinners. And she stayed there till she was 37, when she married a widower, a man who recently lost his wife and had young children. And so she was married to the widower to help raise the children. At 37 years old, she had no children of her own. And Susan Robbins went to work at 6 years old at St Agnes Consols, and was there probably till she was about 21 when the mine closed. And it seems that she probably was recruited as a domestic servant in Plymouth, round about the age of 21, where she met her husband and was married. And you see both of Minnie lived till she was 96 and Susan lived till she was 102. And the old woman at Caen, we don't know her name. She is the middle person in the illustration you see, who had been a servant as a teenager and into her early 20s. And she was pushed down the stairs as a servant and had a head injury, which caused her epilepsy, serious epilepsy. And for over 40 years, she then worked at the mines, despite serious epilepsy. She didn't know her date of birth, she didn't know how long she'd been at the mines, but she knew it was over 40 years. And when asked why she was still working into her late 60s, she said, well, it's either work or the workhouse. Have the next slide, please. I'll just leave you to read those two things, contrasting descriptions of what work was like on the dressing floors. So obviously the working environment varied from summer to winter. How people saw it depended on whether you were mine management and you thought it was a really good idea and it was always wonderful, or whether you were at the receiving end of some really desperate working situations. But generally speaking, if we can go on to the next slide. Well, here we go. I mean, health and safety, what would health and safety have to say about this particular picture today? I mean, nothing is right, really. You see the Bal Maidens up the back, perched on a little plank next to the frames where they're working. The boys are working at the front here around this pool. And there is so many hazards around. And that was fairly typical. And the next slide. Most of the mines in Cornwall, as you well know, the dressing floors are either out on headlands or up on remote moors, exposed to all weathers. So generally very hot, dusty, dry in the summer, and really damp, miserable, sea frets, cold, muddy in the winter. Next slide. The tin streams are a slightly different kettle of fish. These were set up in the main river valleys, the Red River, and in particular, at the point when there was quite a bit of tin ore being lost into the streams from the deep mines in the central mining area. And so some enterprising people set up little catching operations to catch the tin lost into the streams. Here's one just below Ilagan. And that was a much quieter environment. It was a much easier working environment. It wasn't as noisy. There weren't necessarily stamps or steam engines operating. Most was water powered. And so that created a slightly different, if you like, calmer working environment than the dressing floors on the deep mines. And we'll hear more about that in a minute. The daily routine at the mine was set very rigorously. The starting day was, certainly in the 19th century, was 6 o'clock in the morning. Might have a break for Croust around about 9 o'clock, an hour for lunch, and then finish at about 5 o'clock. Sometimes overtime was required. You didn't get extra pay for that, but everything was regulated by the Count House bell. And here we have one surviving at Madron Church, and there's another one in the St Agnes Museum from Wheelcoats. I'll let you read that for a moment. The early methods of payment for these women and girls, and for everybody else for that matter, usually going back certainly to the 18th century and before, would be about 3 monthly if you were lucky on Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas and Christmas. And hence this 3 monthly walk from just across the moors down to Penzance to the bank. And everybody walked back afterwards. And these coins are, some of you will be familiar with the mining tokens, where employees were expected to buy their various goods at the mine shop and would actually be paid in part with mine tokens, which could only be redeemed at the shop. And that was just another way of controlling wages and keeping people at the mine. Oh, there we go. That's right. Yeah, we have the next slide, Amanda. Thank you. And jumping forward a bit to 1841, this shows you some pay rates at Foy consols for the girls. If you start at the bottom, I've put them in order of pay, start at the bottom at 4p. And by the time you're 17, you get 11p a day. So those earning 4p or 5p, it did go by age. And I think those must have been 7 or 8, 9-year-olds. And you got to 11p by the time you were 15, 16, 17. And once you were 18 or over, it would have been a shilling, or if you were lucky, a shilling and 1 penny. And for most of the 19th century, I think that the top end, those earning 11p, that would be equivalent to about a loaf of bread a day, which was a significant thing for a family on, excuse the pun, on the bread line. If these girls could bring back a loaf of bread to that family 5 or 6 days a week, the equivalent of that was the difference between survival. That was the difference between another child going to school or being able to pay a doctor's bill or something like that. So these were crucial earnings, even though they appear very meagre. Next slide, please. Wages weren't always guaranteed. If the world price of metals dropped, then so did your wages. And the next slide, if a mine closed, then you would lose, probably because you were paid either a month or 2 months in arrears. These women and girls would lose that pay as well. And they had no contract. There was no job security. Women and girls were supposed to give a month's notice, and the mine managers were supposed to give a month's notice. But, you know, as you can see here, it was very much a one-way traffic. The next slide. Well, most people are interested in what Bal Maidens wore. And here we go, sort of classic, what we see as Bal Maidens uniform. But this really relates to the 19th century. They didn't dress like this forever. Prior to the 19th century, I think if you see the poldark images, people weren't in gooks, and they were in sort of very, very basic unbleached linens and coarse cloths and hessians and bandanas round their heads. There was none of this lovely white apron, or we hadn't got to that stage where people were actually being judged, if you like, by what they looked like. And so it was a matter of pride for Bal Maidens, increasingly during the 19th century, to scrub their aprons as clean as they could at the end of the week, and to have their bonnets looking as clean as possible as well. But here you have the gook, shawl, big apron that went right around the back, skirt off the floor. In Victorian times that was a bit scandalous, but it had to be off the floor, otherwise you got weighed down in mud. And you compensated by covering your ankles up in swathes of bandages. instead of stockings. There weren't such things generally. And then if you were lucky, boots, steel cap boots or pattens. But many women and girls only had one pair of shoes, and whatever it was, sometimes they were hand-me-downs and they didn't fit. And gloves, this is definitely a 19th century, 20th century touch here with Joyce. She was a Bal Maiden in 1851, but obviously kept wearing her Bal Maiden clothes for, till the close of her life, presumably. So she had gloves. She'd had gloves for Christmas, I think, in 1906. Previous, in the 19th century, that would have been bandages. However, people could wrap and protect their hands. And after the Gook period, we moved into straw bonnets and sometimes a sort of smart jacket going into the early 20th century. Next slide, please, Amanda. Oh, and here we are. You get towards 1890, and Bal Maiden's purchasing power is actually increasing. They're earning a bit more. And you can see this here because they're getting very fashion conscious, and the majority of them here are wearing what's called a yard of cardboard. Obviously wearing to work, but impossible to work in once you're there. So we think that they would have a work apron and a posh apron, and obviously a posh hat and a working gook. So they would go to work and change. You can see somewhere in the picture there are one or two who didn't believe in these newfangled yards of cardboard. They're still in a gook, just hidden away there. Lovely picture, isn't it? That's super. Next slide, please, Amanda. And here we go back to the environment of the tin streams and a description of music was at the heart of mining life in Cornwall, wasn't it? And this is just an illustration of what would be happening at the dressing floors at the tin streams in the rivers. And if anybody was to ask me what is one thing I wished I could go back in time to see or hear, it would be this. It would be to hear the massed choirs of the Red River, Red River, hundreds and hundreds of voices. Right, next slide. We're moving on now. That's a sort of general background, and now we're going to move on to actually what people did in terms of the dressing processes. And the important thing here is to remember that even though the pictures and the images that we're left with often just speak drudgery and physically awful, nearly all of these tasks required not just stamina and strength and perseverance and patience, but also skill and understanding and dexterity and all number of things. And at each point of the process, the Bal Maidens were having to discern what was rubbish, what was waste, what needed to be thrown away, what was really good quality metal ore and ready more or less to go straight to smelting. And the bit in the middle was the bit that had to go on to the next process to go through the same thing again, to be broken down and the same decisions made. So all the time they were having to make those sort of judgments. And although the surface captain or the boss or whoever it is had ultimate responsibility for those things, they were still accountable for the work that they did. So there was skill in it. And the first skill that everybody had to learn going to the mine, boys as well, next slide, Amanda, was to be able to identify the different minerals. I don't know how clear this is. And this first slide is what I call the pretty minerals. And generally speaking, not entirely so, but generally speaking, the copper ores are bright and colourful and reasonably easy to see and detect. But the top two, you've got fool's gold and chalcopyrite copper ore. And that was the first thing that you needed if you were dressing copper ore. You needed to know the difference between fool's gold and copper ore, or else you were fired. and they are very similar, and it's easy to confuse, especially if you're working in poor light. And then we had peacock oars, not so common in Cornwall, but just pretty and easier to identify. But the next slide, you're in a different realm really when you were dressing tin and some of the other minerals, lead, because they're all sort of rather dull and grey and not so easy to identify. I'm useless at it, but obviously these women and girls and boys could do it very, very quickly, and were renowned, and people remarked on the skill and the quickness with which children could pick out the different ores and put them to one side. And wolfram as well, which tungsten, this one over here, to start with, it was just considered waste. But of course, by the time of the First World War, then that was a very important component of mining in Cornwall for the war effort. And that was easily mistaken tin and wolfram. So that was another thing that you needed to get right. The next slide, please. We're going to look at copper dressing, and as far as I can make out, as far as most other people can make out, when we're talking about lead and silver together, zinc, cobalt, antimony, we believe that most of the dressing for all of these elements were very similar. So although we're talking about copper, we can imagine that Bal Maidens handling any of these other minerals, and they could be in sort of all sorts of mixes at any one mine, then we're talking about these processes. So can we go on to the next slide? And here we see the processes for this copper ore and the others I've mentioned. There's two stages. There's physical breaking, and then there's lots of washing and separating out according to density on a basically either in boxes or on a slope. But this is the breaking, a very simple picture of breaking. And the first women, we start on the left-hand side at the front. The first two women are using fairly long-handled hammers to break large lumps down, the first breaking that the women do. And then the second woman on her knees just behind them, she's breaking down to a smaller grade. And then there's another woman underneath the, almost underneath the whim, but not right over on the right-hand side. And she appears to be actually, if you look, breaking with two hands, two hammers. That's the only image I've ever seen of that. And she is breaking to a fine powder and gravel. And I think what's happening, that what she has there has been taken to the boy in what I think is a primitive buddle on the ground on the right-hand side. And he is probably working, got a sieve or something in there, and is doing some sort of washing there. Now that's obviously a very old illustration, and we're going to move on to slightly more modern 19th century renderings of that. Next slide, Amanda, please. And here we go, this first process of the women and girls using long handles, standing up to break the biggest lumps that came to surface would be broken by male labourers. Thereon, everything was done by women and children. And the first breaking, this spalling, done by young or adult women. And the next slide, those cobble-sized pieces would be taken on to people to cob. And this is done sitting down with a small hammer, and they break those cobbled-sized pieces, broken down to pieces about the size of a nut. And at that point, have the next slide, that is the point at which the very youngest girls and boys would pick out the waste. They'd throw it sort of under the table into a box underneath that we can't see. They would take out the best quality bits of ore, the shiny bits, and put them in those little boxes, because that's the size at which it could go off to the smelter, not need any further processing. And what was left on the bench would be carried off to the next process. The girl in the front has actually washed this material. It's come from the cobbers. It's been washed over a grate here, and she's lifting it onto the table for the girls to do the picking. And it's usually 9, 8, the youngest girls and boys, you know, the 6 to 11-year-olds doing the picking, and they did it at speed. Next one. So here we've got the cobbed pieces being brought in a hand barrow, tipped onto a table in front of these girls who are doing the bucking, and they are really pounding and grinding. Although it looks as if they're hitting it, in actual fact, this process was more to do with pounding and grinding to a sort of gravel and powder. And when they'd finished, it's all dropped on the floor around their ankles. They're stood on boxes or stones to keep their ankles out of the damp. And when they've finished, then they sieve the stuff that's gone on the ground, put the stuff that isn't broken fine enough back onto their anvil on the top there, and beat it again. But the fine stuff goes off to the washings. And the next slide. Oh no, well, here we are. Here's a bucking hammer that used to be at the Zena Folk Museum to show the amount of wear. And that bucking hammer weighs about 7 or 8 pounds. And you're using that 10 hours a day. The next slide. And the washings, I don't have a Cornish picture of the Buddle washings, but here's a Welsh Bal Maiden, if you like, washing on a slope. So the finer material comes in on a wave of water, and because the purest stuff is heavy, because it's got the metal ore, it settles out at the top of a slope, and the waste settles out at the bottom. So that is the skill in this task of actually making sure that it separates out cleanly, and then taking off the table the right grades, the best, the middle, and the waste. The next one. And the coarser portions were put in these big boxes which are full of water, and the boxes are lifted up and down by means of this lever that the girls are operating, and the different grades of ore separate out in different zones in the boxes. Next one. Tin dressing was different. You notice I didn't mention tin dressing in the list of ores. Tin is much more, as an ore, is much more resilient. So the first thing yes, right, Amanda, the next slide. The next thing you can do with tin is pound it to death. The other ones, if you pounded it to death, you lost it all. It just got lost in the washings, whereas tin doesn't do that. So we still have the spalling, the first breaking. Here we have, you see, that's not a young woman, is it, in this picture? She has broken the larger pieces of rock into these cobble pieces. They're being put on the cart to go to the stamps. So the next slide. And the stamps can pound and pound and pound to slimes and sands without destroying the structure of the tin. And from there on, it's no more physical breaking. It's all washes, and it can be up to between 100 and 120 washes. And again, women and girls involved. Here we have latter day 1880s, 1890s buddles, where the women have been, previously they might operate buddles, but by then the buddles are being operated by men and boys, and the women and girls are just helping, doing the fetching, the carrying, and the unclogging of the channels and the messy stuff. This is another part of the process where the sands are poured into these big tubs, these keeves, and then they're banged on the side, and again it settles in layers and can be taken out according to grade. And although this shows boys and men doing this task, this was done by women and girls as well. And the most important, really, the most skilled task, the last one, the finest of the slimes, was settled out on a frame. Again, the whole process is on a slope, so that the good stuff settles at the top and the waste comes off at the bottom. And here we have just an early frame where one girl is required, one woman is required for one frame. And the next one. And here we have a bit later on, I think some of these girls have come in from other places for this photograph. I think there are about four Bal Maidens operating about 4 to 6 frames each on these semi-automated frames. And the next slide. And here at Dolcoath, where they had more up-to-date technology, then I think these women are responsible for about 32 frames each, where it is fully automated and they just have to make sure that everything's working and nothing clogs up the system and the water's coming through. So just an illustration how technology gradually replaced the women and girls. Other minerals we've got, what have we got? Let's have a look. Next slide. Yes, Bal Maidens might be responsible for arsenic dressing and also filling the arsenic calciners, as you see in this illustration. The tin and copper in Cornwall is usually heavily impregnated with arsenic. It was treated as a waste product until about 1850 or 60. And either way, it had to be burnt off. And latterly, it was collected in flues. But you see, this is the burning off stage. So the arsenic is burnt off into flues, and the tin or the copper is left in the furnace, and that is taken out and dressed in the usual way. The next slide. There were women dressing clay as the clay pans were emptied and the china clay was dug out from the pits. Then the women and girls were responsible for ferrying it about, storing it, cleaning it, packing cases, various tasks at the clay works. And they were called Bal Maidens at the clay works as well. Next slide. And then we get on to the other tasks that they might do at the mine. On the right-hand side here at the front, you can see 2 women with a hand barrow. There were teams of women and girls just hand barrowing all day, taking stuff between processes. And those hand barrows would hold 1,500 weight of dry ore. That's how much they were carrying, assuming the ore was dry, and it rarely was. And the hand barrow was heavy. So that was considerable weight to carry around all day. And the little dome thing behind them is a dole. That's one of the ways in which the copper and tin ore was set out in order for sampling. And there was another team of women or girls who were responsible for setting out the doles. That might be what these 2 are doing. There were women employed at the hand pumps to keep the clay works empty. That's just a hand drawing by John Tonkin. The next slide. There were women who were responsible for handling horses at the mine, whether they were at the whim, whether they were mine wagoners. And this wonderful lady, Grace Briney, was actually a kibble lander, the only known female kibble lander in Cornwall. That was a man's job, one of the most dangerous, well, it was the most dangerous job at surface, because you could so easily end up down the mine shaft yourself, or, you know, tip a kibble, a bucket down on top of somebody else down the mine shaft, or end up with your pony down the mine shaft. I mean, it really was skilled and dangerous. And Gracie, in her younger days from this photo, became a kibble lander after having been horse driver at the whim as a child. I'll let you read that. Yes, I can see some people laughing. That's lovely, isn't it? But it was only later on that a lot of the mines actually had a dinner room, a kitchen, if you like, where people would take their pasties and have them warmed. But there we are. This lady's name was Jennifer Terrell. She sounds like quite a character. And Count House women, a lot of, as mentioned them already, very often women who were widows of miners were given the job of being Count House staff. And the Count House was always busy. There were always dinners to be prepared every day, laundry, mine officers' laundry to be washed and mended, hot baths to be prepared, rooms to be cleaned, a full-time job for many of the Count House staff. There were 4 count houses at Dolcoath, and they had, I think, either 4 or 6 count house women at each. Yeah. Oh, this one's in because the count house at Gew Mine down at Lelant, the count house kitchen disappeared down a mine shaft overnight. It had been built over a mine shaft and nobody knew it. So the count house staff turned up to work one morning and discovered that the kitchen table, all of their kitchen equipment, everything had gone down the mine shaft, and they'd been working there for, one of them been working there for 35 years without knowing that their kitchen was over the mine shaft. And eventually it gave way. One of the most skilled jobs that women and girls actually did at the mine was being called up to the assay office to assist the assayer. They were seen to be of promise on the floors. Then I think they were called up for this particular job. And while you read that, Mary Ann Bickerlegg was in the assay office at Dolcoath for 20 or 30 years. And to quote, she was thought to know as much about tin as the mine agents. And if we go on to the next slide, Elizabeth Ashton, she was not born in Cornwall. She was a very rare Victorian woman who I think went to London University and obtained a degree. Well, sat through the lectures. She wouldn't have been given a degree in those days, but was allowed to sit in the lectures for a chemistry degree, and came with her husband and brother-in-law to set up a photographic and pharmacy shop in St Ives. And part of that, they actually bought the land out at Hawke's Point, which is Bladden Carrig now. And it included a mine, or they set up a mine, but it failed commercially. There was not enough of any particular mineral. There was copper, cobalt, nickel, a whole range of things that they could use in their pharmacy and their photography shop. And so they ran it themselves for many years. And Elizabeth was the main smelter. She worked out in their little smelting hut out on the cliffs, and was seen to work there late into the night. The next slide. And some women became mine managers. Philippa Lovering here, this is her handwriting, keeping accounts for her husband at Nine Stones Clayworks. When he died, she took over this very extensive business of not just one clayworks, but 5 or 6, and was one of 3 or 4 women who were really driving forces and clay barons, you know, of their day in the industry. And the next slide. And I've only got a record of 2 women actually managing a mine as such in Cornwall. Would love to hear of any others. Joyce Lidgie, who took over Magdalen Mine during World War I, and again was a driving force, and Lydia Taylor, who was managing East Wheel Lovell near Helston in the 1840s. but had a very torrid time from some gentlemen who really were not very on the level with her. She had a difficult time, I think. And that leads us on to what happened. Although most of the women and girls were replaced or the mines had closed by the 1920s, quite a few actually were called up for war service. So if we just look at these very quickly, for instance, here's a team of women who were redressing the lead waste heaps at Wheal Mary Ann in Menheniot area, redressing it for Wolfram during World War I. And the next slide will be 50 women and girls were called up when Polpuff orthoclase mine was reopened at St Denis, and the orthoclase was being used for high quality optics, for, rumour has it, submarine periscopes and things like that, but generally gun sightings, all those sorts of things that are needed in wartime. And women called up when men left for the front in World War I to work the monitors in the clay works. Next one. Coming on to World War II, there were six girls, women, on the tin picking belt down at Givor during World War II. And next one, packing china clay in the St Austell area. And not in Cornwall, but about 50 women and girls also at the Hemerdon Wolfram mine, just the other side of Plymouth. And yep, very briefly now, almost towards the end. One of the things I'm asked most frequently after why did I get interested in this work is how did the work affect the women and girls? How did it affect their health and their longevity? There's no way of measuring that. There's just no statistical evidence that we can do that. We can only guess. Firstly, they were living in, most of them, in the 18th and 19th century against a backdrop of general poor health in the community. So many died of what anybody else would have died. And here we have an illustration of Elizabeth Spry's grave, Beer Alston. And she just died, what, I don't know, perhaps we thought was a modern disease from meningitis in 1875. But I've been keeping a record of age of death and causes of death for where I can. And I think it's definitely, kill or cure. If people were not of good health when they came to the mine surface to work, they would not survive. They would not, they would have to they'd be sacked. And it might even kill them. But for those that were fit and healthy, there are all sorts of descriptions of them, just how fit and healthy and strong these women and girls were. And the amazing thing is, look, I've got 240 names, and I know how old people were when they died. And of 100 of those, they lived to over 70 years, 50 lived to over 80 years, and 6 lived to over 100 years. Now, that is quite extraordinary. I think that's more of a statistic that we might, it's almost like a present day statistic, isn't it? So I think, although it's a skewed sample, I think that if these women and girls worked for any length of time at the mines, it set them, if they were lucky, it would set them up for life in terms of good health and good physical structure. And the next slide, but there were casualties, and there was no recording of minor injuries, and it's very difficult to find records of the serious injuries, but these are what I've found. And they are in date order, starting at the earliest that we have a record for to the most recent. And the reason I've picked out some in red is because it just shows that between a third and a half of all of those accidents were caused by people being drawn into machinery. And it's been shown through other research that women and girls are at a disadvantage during this period because their clothing is just so unsuitable for working near what was nearly always unprotected machinery. And the accident rate for women and girls who are allowed to wear trousers at work was lower, and the accident rate for boys working at surface is also lower. So they were really very much at risk. And yeah, just to sum up really how many women and girls we think worked at the mines in Cornwall. This is quite a stab in the dark, but if we take the industrial era that they were employed between 1720 and 1920, I think it's at least 80,000. I think it's probably 100,000 or more. And the last, as it says here, the last Bal Maidens were laid off in Cornwall. Traditional Bal Maidens were laid off between 1914 and 1922, with the exception of a few coming back in World War II. And the next slide. But is that the end of the story? Because it isn't the end of the story for mining in Cornwall or Devon at the moment, is it? With various new projects underway to exploit remaining tin and lithium and other minor, very valuable minerals in Cornwall and across the border in Devon. And the last time I spoke to some of the team at South Crofty, that was about 18 months ago, I was told that over 50% of the technical team at South Crofty currently are women. They are over 50% of the geologists, the mining engineers, the mineralogists, the computer science, you name it, over 50%. So it wasn't the end of the Bal Maiden story, really, in 1922. We're now entering a new chapter, and hopefully these women will have much better working conditions and consideration than their forebears had. But it's a different chapter. Oh, and that's just to say, any further information you would like, you can find on our website. And in particular, we've got a searchable database of 30,000 named women that we have found. We haven't found the other 70,000 yet. We're working on it. If anybody can actually give us any extra information, that would be, well, any information at all, any time, that would be lovely. Thank you.